Thank you, Dr. Priya Aristotle and George Varghese for this privilege to be talking to you about corruption and rule of law. 22 years ago, we transitioned from the 20th century into the 21st century. That time, we also transitioned from the second millennium after Christ to the third millennium, and we are at the very dawn of the third millennium. One of the greatest historians of the 20th century was Paul Johnson, an English historian from Roman Catholic background. Towards the end of the century, which was also the end of the millennium, he began to raise the question about what was the greatest achievement of the human civilization during the previous millennium, the millennium that was ending. We had split the atom, we had landed on the moon, we had fought many diseases and overcome them. We had climbed the Mount Everest, etc., etc. And scientific, technological, architectural adventures had been phenomenal during the last 1,000 years. But Paul Johnson concluded that the greatest achievement of human beings during the previous millennium was the rule of law. That law will rule over human beings, not the rulers. Rule of law, not the rule of rulers. That rulers, prime ministers, presidents, members of parliament, ministers can be sent to jail if they violate the rights and dignity of the smallest human beings. Governments exist not to rule over us, but to serve us. Prime minister means first servant. The government exists not to rob us of our rights because they didn't give human beings their fundamental or inalienable rights, but they are given the authority to defend our rights and promote a social, legal, political, economic climate in every country so that individuals can blossom and develop. The law, a rule of law equals freedom. A human being is free to the degree that the authority and power of the rulers over them is limited. What limits the authority of the rulers? It's the law, it's the Constitution. And this is not just Paul Johnson, a British historian, saying that this was the highest achievement of human civilization during the last 1,000 years. Here in India, one of the most important and most respected constitutional lawyer was Nani Palkiwala, who's passed away. And he repeatedly said during the last several quarter century of the last century, last millennium, that during the 4,000 years or so of human history and prehistory in India, many civilizations rose and fell, but no civilization ever gave us the concept of rule of law. They never gave us law that should govern over us. This was one of the greatest contribution of the British rule in India. Now, of course, he didn't realize that this was not a contribution of colonialism. This was a constitution of the contribution of people who loved God and his word, who were called evangelicals during the 19th century, Victorian era. It was a contribution of the evangelical movement to India to give us the concept of constitutionalism and rule of law, because even in Europe, Paul Johnson doesn't discuss this explicitly in his many of his books, but how did Europe come to appreciate or transform the political system that not the rulers, but the law will rule over us? Well, in this book, the book that this book changed everything, there is a chapter on the history of rule of law. That's a lecture I gave in Berlin in 2018 to a group of lawyers, judges, law professors from 36 European countries. It was a 3-hour session, so the participants had about 1.5 hours to question, and so many of the judges and lawyers, I was amazed, came up to me and even said publicly that we have been teaching law in European universities, but we've never heard this history of the origin of the concept of rule of law. Let me briefly summarize that before coming to my second point, which is that corruption undermines rule of law, it undermines constitution, it undermines Indian Penal Code. So that's the second part of my discussion. But the first point, how did the world get this concept that law should rule, not of the rulers? Now, to specific historical points where, of course, Martin Luther, the reformer, German reformer, in 1520, he wrote 3 books. His third book was called A Treatise on Christian Liberty, A Treatise on Christian Liberty. No university in India will tell you, and no historian in India will tell you, that the modern understanding of politics as pursuit of freedom began with Luther's 1520 book, A Treatise on Christian Liberty. When I studied politics, political science in Allahabad University, our course began on modern political theory. In ancient political theory, you read Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, but modern political theory course begins with Machiavelli's The Prince. Now, our professors never told us that Machiavelli's book was published in 1532. That's 12 years after Luther's book, 1520. There may have been a handwritten draft which Machiavelli, who was older than Luther, had written before 1520, but that book was never published and was never available to anyone. It had no ripples until after 1532. It is discussing his book, The Prince, is discussing political realism, beginning with Alexander the Great until his own time, the 16th century. Machiavelli was a diplomat who had traveled around and lived in many different states in Italy as a diplomat. And he is studying, the question of his book is, how does a prince acquire power? And how does a prince retain power? Because once there are lots of nobilities, lots of people have claimed that I should be the king. How does a prince actually become, a nobility actually becomes a prince? And then many people want to kill him, get rid of him, dethrone him. How does he retain his power? So that's where Chanakya Niti comes in, that you use everything, you be nice, you be polite, you appear to be just and fair, but you also plot, intrigue, murder, assassinations, genocide, whatever is needed to retain power, you retain power. That's Machiavelli's The Prince. Now, Luther, as a Bible student, is seeing that Bible is about freedom. The Bible begins to be written when God sends Moses to liberate slaves, Hebrews, from the slavery of Egypt. And then as he's taking them into the promised land of shalom, political peace and liberty, where a land will be flowing with milk and honey, Moses knows that Jewish rulers will arise who will be worse than pharaohs, who will enslave their own people, bully their own people, take their daughters, take their sons, take their lands, take their vineyards. So Moses is discussing in Genesis to Deuteronomy how this freedom that you have received can be made permanent. And that's where he gives the concept of rule of law, that you will have rulers. They must make copies of this law, meditate upon it day and night, not turn from it to the left or to the right. This is what God has said to Abraham 450 years before Moses. God has said to Abraham in Genesis 18, verses 18 and 19, that Abraham will surely become a great nation because he will teach his children and his household, his ethne and his non-ethne, those who are not biologically but his children, but part of his extended family. And he had 318 men, presumably more than 318 women, and many children and grandchildren was part of his household. So Abraham will surely become a great nation because he will teach his children and his family to walk in my ways, learn my laws, do what is just, what is right, etc. This is what will make Abraham a great nation. So 450 years later, Moses repeats that in Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 to 8. Moses says to the Jews at the end of his life, as they are going to possess the land, that I have taught you all of these laws, statutes, ordinances, commandments. If you obey them, you will become a great nation. You wouldn't have to say that we are the greatest nation. All your neighbors will say that you are a very wise people. You are a great nation because no one else has laws as good as you have. And the fact that you obey those laws means that God is dwelling with you. As Jesus said, if you obey my commandments, my Father will come and live with you. I will come and live with you. God will dwell with you. And the presence of God in your life will be evident to everyone. And that's what will make you a great and wise nation. This is what Samuel repeats more than 400 years later after Moses, when people ask for a king and he anoints Saul to become the king. Moses says that you are doing terrible thing asking for a king. This is what everybody else has, and their kings terrorize them. Their kings govern with militias that rape your women, loot your houses and your crops. You're asking for a terrible thing, but God has given you what you're asking. This will work if your rulers, your kings, make copies of law, meditate upon it day and night, and not turn from it to the left or to the right. If you do not have this concept of rule of law, if you do not practice it, your rulers will become much worse than Egyptian pharaohs, etc. So this concept of rule of law was that God has given the law. Moses has made a wooden chest, covered it with gold, put it in the center of the camp. The whole camp is organized around this law, and people are asked to make copies of it. They complain that we don't have pen and paper here in the wilderness. And Moses says, don't make silly excuses. You write this on your walls, on your doorposts. You teach your women to stitch these laws in your garments. You must become a people who read, who write, who meditate, who think, who cultivate their minds. And you must become professors. You must teach this law to your own children. Your dining table must be a classroom for your children and grandchildren. So this is a transformation that the concept of rule of law, that law is instilled. It is not about external ceremonies. By the time of Ezekiel, it's clear that Israel has turned law into an external ceremony. Their hearts are not obedient to God. So God destroys the nation, sends them into slavery, captivity to Babylon. But God promises that I'm going to resurrect Israel. This will be the work of the Holy Spirit. He will write God's law into your heart. Because when God is saying, meditate upon it day and night, he is saying that you are not supposed to be worshipers of a book or a text, but you are those whose hearts are shaped by this law. It's written in your heart. You're meditating upon it. You're teaching it every Sabbath. You're taking the time to come and sit in the presence of God and have his word expounded and applied into your heart. So this concept of rule of law, Martin Luther understands, and he explains, because this is what, at that time, Luther is already teaching the book of Galatians. His study of the book of Romans has started the Great Reformation, but his study of the book of Galatians, because Paul is fighting for freedom in the book of Galatians. Chapter 5, verse 1 says, for freedom Christ has set you free. Do not let anyone enslave you. Not even Jewish believers should enslave you, the circumcision party, because religion is not about circumcision in the flesh or baptism which is external, but circumcision of the heart, when the Holy Spirit takes the law of God and writes it into your heart. And this is what sets you free. So that's what Paul is teaching in Galatians, which Luther expounds. Now, much later, of course, about 60, 70 years later, Luther's treatise on Christian liberty begins to be secularized by a French philosopher, Jean Bodin, who is reacting against the French Huguenots, the French Calvinists. We do not have the time to discuss that background, but 1572 was the great massacre of French Calvinists in Paris and all around France, but intellectually, the biblical Christianity, Protestant movement was winning France. So to fight against the biblical influence in France, Jean Bodin, that is John Bodin, he takes Luther's ideas and begins to secularize freedom. And that's the nonsense which most of our political science, faculties of political science and history teach us, that the concept of freedom comes from Rousseau, who is 200 years or 250 years after Luther and Calvin. That his, when I was studying political science, this was amazing that our professors are telling us that French Revolution was a disaster, which begins 10 years after the American Revolution, and within 3 years becomes a reign of terror and ends into the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. And yet they're saying that Rousseau, Voltaire, these French Enlightenment thinkers, are the source of modern freedoms. So our universities have been deceiving us, and they have been far more damaging than saffronization of curriculum that the BJP is talking about. Now, eventually, saffronization of Indian education might become much worse than what the Congress did and what the leftist historians and political scientists did, but that's a different matter. Right now, my point is that all of this theological controversy that grows out of Luther, treatise on Christian liberty, Machiavelli's The Prince, culminates in the Westminster Confession, which is being written in 1640s in England, in London, in the Westminster Abbey, which has become the Parliament. So all the theologians have gathered, these mostly Puritan theologians under Oliver Cromwell's government. They are writing the Westminster Confession. John Locke at that moment is a teenager studying in Westminster Abbey. And Samuel Rutherford, the Scottish theologian, he comes and he's part of the group that is writing the Westminster Confession. What is the essence of biblical worldview? But in that process, Samuel Rutherford writes the book Lex Rex, The Law and the Prince. And he's responding to, philosophically, he's responding to Machiavelli, that Machiavelli is saying that prince should rule, and Rutherford, Presbyterian theologian, is arguing that no, law is the prince. Law is the ruler. Prince is under the law. Now, my time is almost running out, so I won't go into the detail, but I would recommend you that you buy this book. It's available online from triads.com, also from Amazon, I think 700, 800 rupees from Chennai, you can get it. And do consider this history of law, which our law colleges and our history departments and our political science departments do not teach. And it discusses how the Justinian law was born and out of the Chalcedon Church Council, which affirmed that Jesus is not man who became God. He's God who became man. If God has become man to establish his kingdom on this earth, then he is the ruler of the kings of the earth, as Revelation 1:5 says. He is the King of kings. He is the Lord of lords. Kings must bow before him. That's where the rulers of this world began to lose their power. Servants, ministers increased their power. First minister, the prime minister, became the most important office. And all of these early ministers were trained by the church in the law of God. And so all the universities were Christian universities. They were institutions of the church, for the church, by the church. Through the universities, the church was, and the first university was in Italy, in Bologna, as the law university, because the church had created the best and the biggest and most trustworthy, never perfect, but most trustworthy and loved judicial system. Bishop was the judge in most of these, in all of these courts, in bishoprics. The prince, the nobility were also judges, but nobody wanted to be judged by them because they're illiterate drunkards, debauched, who are passing judgments because of what their wife says, their concubine says, or their cook says, or their soldiers say, punish this guy, free that guy. That's how the royal justice was being done in Europe. So people wanted the bishop and the judge, but bishops did not know the law, did not know Justinian code. So those priests and monks who had gone to law colleges, law universities, they became lawyers after they would take an oath that they are going to serve God with their knowledge of law. They're going to serve God's kingdom. They're going to serve the church, they are going to help the bishop as the judge to establish justice on this earth. Now, as the litigants didn't actually see the judge. Judge was sitting behind a wooden pulpit, which was in Latin, chancel. So chancellors still rule Germany, Switzerland, Austria, etc. Chancel is German word. Council was the Latin word for the pulpit. The man behind the pulpit, who is teaching God's law, is the chancellor. So we have continued that tradition of our university professors being chancellor, head of the university being chancellor or vice chancellor. That tradition comes from the man behind the pulpit who's opening God's law, opening God's word. I have a chapter in this book on the meaning of chancellor also. So please do get it, because you're not going to learn these things through historians whose minds have been corrupted by secular humanism. They're not going to tell you these things. You have to research for yourself. So the chancellor was a legal position, a monk, a priest who had specialized in law, who sat between the judge who is behind the chancel, who people don't see, and the litigants who are on the other side of the hall. In the between is the chancellor, who is explaining the law to the judge and then explaining the verdict to the people. So he is a man who is an expert in Roman law, canon law, biblical law. That man is the chancellor, and he's the mediator. And you don't see the judge, and judge doesn't see you, because judge is not supposed to be judging according to how rich you are, how famous you are, how well connected you are. Justice is blind. Judge doesn't see you. Judge has to pass verdicts, give verdicts on the basis of the law and the merit of the case, not by looking at the people. This is what Paul is saying, that you must be fair, and Moses is repeating that repeatedly, that you shouldn't judge in favor of the poor or in favor of the rich. You have to judge according to God's law, because you want God's kingdom come to earth. You want God's will to be done on earth. This is what created the concept of rule of law. Well, let me quickly move on to how corruption has undermined this biblical idea, partly because the church has not been teaching the truth. It is sad that the biblical Christianity, which gave rule of law to India, the IPC, Indian Penal Code, and the constitutionalism, that church was corrupted, theologically corrupted, not just by liberalism, which doesn't believe that God has spoken and given his word, but by evangelicalism. American evangelicalism became a theological problem because 100 years ago, Scofield and company began to say that the grace of God makes the law of God redundant. Therefore, the evangelical movement, beginning with Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton College in Dallas and Biola and Fuller, none of them had law faculties. None of them have law faculties today. You go there to study the Bible, and their theologians pretend that Bible has nothing to do with law, because they don't know that all of the modern law with which they are governed and we are governed comes from the Bible. And that evangelicalism was imported by our seminaries, and we're teaching that to our pastors. So our pastors have been ignorant of how the Bible created modern India and brought this great blessing of the rule of law. Therefore, a whole new reformation is needed in India and in the world. But because the church abdicated the realm of law to the devil, what happened? In 1980, there was a hailstorm in my district, Chhatarpur, where I was serving the poor. I prayed that the Lord will help me to give relief to these victims, and 100 villages or so, ripe wheat crop had been flattened. Next morning, the director of EFICOR came to visit me. I knew nothing about him, but he had heard of my book, The World of Gurus, and he had heard that there was this crazy couple who was out in the village in the middle of nowhere serving the poor. He was visiting Khajuraho temples, and so he said, I stopped to see you. He said that when I stepped out of the bus in Chhatarpur, that's when the hailstorm began. So I saw the hailstorm, though I didn't understand the magnitude of the damage it had done. So he offered to help us with the relief work. We asked farmers who have lost their crop and their roofs, the brittle handmade country tiles, to apply for relief. I got a notice from the district collector, hand-delivered, district magistrate, hand-delivered, that there is a law in Madhya Pradesh which says that in the event of natural calamity, no one is allowed to collect donations. No private party is allowed to collect donations without the government's approval. Your relief work is illegal. Stop it. It was a formal notice from the district magistrate. I responded formally saying, thank you, sir. I did not know of this law. We shall obey the law and we shall stop our relief work. We will not collect any donation. We will only give. So I got a second formal notice. If you're not collecting donations, how can you give? Stop your work. This is illegal. So I responded again formally that the scriptures command us to obey the magistrate. We shall obey you. We shall not give relief, but we shall invite the farmers to come and pray for relief. Who knows, the government itself might grant relief. I got a third notice, hand-delivered, 8:30 at night in my home, saying that your prayer meeting is illegal. I have intelligence report that your prayer meeting will disrupt law and order in my district. It will disturb peace and tranquility. Therefore, your prayer meeting is banned. Stop it. No, we were not praying in a church. We were praying in Gandhi Ashram, a Gandhian-style prayer meeting, which used to be very theistic and Christian prayer meeting. That's what we had called for. He stopped it. So we had to consider, do we have to obey this order? Or is this order illegal, a violation of the constitutional freedom that Hindus, Muslims, Christians have to come together and to pray to God for relief? So we decided that this is an order we cannot obey. If we obey it, we are no longer shepherds. We are serving for salaries. When trouble comes, wolves come, we run away. The sheep have no reason to trust us, to follow us. So this is an order we cannot obey. We have to disobey. We have to take the consequences. So that's where my theology of civil disobedience began to develop, which was later published in the book Truth and Transformation. Now, Superintendent of Police called me to his home. He sent a jeep, invited me, made me sit in his lawn. And here is an IPS officer, a gazetted officer, highly educated. He spent half an hour telling me that I have a thick 300-page file on you. I know what you're doing in every village. I know that no one else has done for the poor in Chhatarpur what you're doing. I've not read your book, The World of Gurus, but I have all the reviews which the national press, Sunday Magazine had reviewed the book for 8 or 9 weeks in a row, summarizing one chapter every week. So I have all the reviews of your book. I know that we don't have anyone in our district who is an international author of your stature. You are a gem in my district, but you cancel that Wednesday morning prayer meeting. Otherwise, I will personally kill you. I do not need a warrant. I will not arrest you. I will not take you before a magistrate. I will come to your home, take you from your home into the jungle, shoot you, throw your body. Lakar Bagghas, the hyenas, will eat you. Are you going to cancel Wednesday prayer meeting? Well, I said, sir, I'll have to ask my wife if she's okay being a widow. He assumed that I was not taking him seriously. So he spent an hour telling me how many people he had personally killed, innocent people, public figures, including the Maharaja of Bundi in Rajasthan that he had killed. I couldn't believe that here is the highest police officer who has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of India, which guarantees my fundamental right to life, my fundamental right to religious freedom and prayer. He's telling me that if I don't cancel a prayer meeting in the Gandhi Ashram, he will personally kill me. Is it possible? Well, he thought that my wife loves me enough and would not want me to be killed. So he sent me home. We had about 30, 40 people living together outside a village, part of the community serving the poor. We talked about it, some of the people were very intelligent, and they said that, look, we must not underestimate the power of darkness. Police, supported by district magistrate, can actually do what he's telling you that he will do. Rule of law is an artificial covering behind the nakedness of our society, which is shameful, which is filthy. They can do it. So we should probably wind up our ministry here and move to Delhi, work in a slum where we might have support of the national press, etc. Well, we talked about it and we decided, no, God has called us to serve the poor here. We must serve. We have to do what we have to do. They can do what they want to do. In the morning, a truckload of police, the police had intelligence in our community. So there were no phones, but they knew what's happening. So a truckload of police, jeep load of police came, arrested me. I was thrown in Tikamgarh jail. They couldn't keep me in Chhatarpur jail because there would be trouble. Our chairman, Dr. Mate Gaonkar, who was one of the co-founders of Emmanuel Hospital Association, and my wife and other ladies led the prayer. I was thrown in jail for a week. That's where I began to write the book, what is now known as Truth and Transformation, translated into many languages, How Truth Transforms. Now, in the other book called The Book That Made Your World, How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization, the question was, how did some nations develop a culture where the police and the military exist to defend my rights, defend my dignity, defend my freedom, not to bully me? That was the idea that Indian law, Indian constitution accepted from the evangelical climate of the Victorian England. We accepted that, but we didn't get the reality of it in our hearts. What has happened? Well, the problem was the MLA. He was a Congress MLA who used to be a criminal, but thanks to Arjun Singh, he became an MLA. He understood that what we were doing, this relief for 100 villages through a Hail Relief program, this will have tremendous political, social, religious implications. I have to be stopped. I have to be eliminated. Otherwise, there will be a spiritual, social, political revolutions. Criminals will not be able to rule. Okay, so Emily had a criminal background. Why does district magistrate, an IAS officer, a district superintendent of police, IPS officer, why do they have to follow a pressure from MLA to stop this work that I'm doing? Well, the answer was corruption. MLA knows how much bribes the police superintendent of police is taking. He knows how much bribe the district collector and the collectorate is taking, how much of the public funds are being siphoned off into private accounts from the district collector's office. If the magistrate, if the police officer does not listen to this corrupt criminal MLA, the MLA can have these magistrates and superintendent SP go to jail. So collector and SP will go to jail for corruption charges if they do not listen to the MLA. Corruption undermines the Constitution, the Indian Penal Code. It makes a mockery. The courts in India have become, not because of the judges only, but because of the lawyers. And as I'm speaking to the lawyers, let me be direct. What is a city? शहर क्या है? शहर लुटेरों की बस्ती है. Ken was the first man who founded a city. Jacques Ellul, a French sociologist, has written a book, The Meaning of the City. City is a congregation of robbers. Village people work hard. They come to the court in the city. They come to hospitals in the city. They come to Mandi in the city. They send their children to good English medium schools in the city. They're being robbed through legal institutions, through medical institutions, through the police force, through the mandis, the agricultural business, through the banks. The city is a people, a group of people who are a community of robbers. That's why in India, village means poverty, city means relative affluence. When someone is driven to bankruptcy in the village, he migrates to the city to work as a laborer or as a beggar. This is what calls for a national transformation in India. Hearts have to be transformed. Now, I've run out of my time. I should give you at least 10 minutes for discussion. So I will stop here. What Ezekiel is saying, that Jerusalem, the holy city, has become the center of unholiness, den of robbers. Temple has become a den of robbers. Therefore, God has destroyed the temple. God has destroyed his city. God has destroyed his nation, sent them into slavery. And slavery is the future of a nation that is corrupt. But God promises new birth. I will send my spirit. I will transform your hearts. I will give you a new heart. I will write my law in your heart so that you will begin to obey my law, my word. You will become a tree of life that is planted by the sides of flowing waters, bearing fruit of righteousness. And the fruit of the righteous is the tree of life, and bearing leaves that are for the healing of the nations. That's the vision for national transformation, which is encapsulated in our project, Bless India, which is part of a third education revolution that we have launched. And you can come and pray with us on Wednesday nights at 9:30 p.m. in India time for a global education revolution. On Thursdays at 9 p.m. Prayer Wednesday is 9:30. Thursday evening is 9 o'clock, where we are considering what God has done in creating modern India, including giving us the Indian Penal Code and Constitution, the whole concept of rule of law and jurisprudence, which both liberal Christianity and evangelical Christianity have abundant. How to reform these things, how to take responsibility for reshaping the future. People who believe in a savior God, as Rabindranath Tagore did, God is the savior. The destiny of India is in his hand because providence rules. If you believe that God is able to change sinners, save sinners, transform them into saints, you can have hope for India, even though as lawyers who experience corruption in your law practices with your colleagues, with your judges, with the peons and chaprasis and clerks, you may be frustrated when you look at darkness. But Charles Grant, the man who was the prophet for modern India, he said that the true and the only cure for darkness is light. God wants us to become children of light, and may India light up because of God's children in the profession of law. Thank you very much. We still have 7 minutes left.
Thank you, Dr. Vishal. You are unstoppable. And so we may take a little extra time in case people have questions. There have been many comments in the box appreciating what they are hearing. And as you rightly said, we don't listen to these in law colleges. I had to do my own research once I joined your team, and it was amazing what I learned. So please type out your questions in the chat box. You can address it to me or Dr. Vishal directly or to Sister Namrata. and we will take up your questions. If you want, you could raise your hand. We could unmute you. Okay. You can specifically put your email address saying you want to join Bless India. Many people have asked Dr. Vishal that they want to join the Bless India. So we will be adding you, and you can also subscribe to the YouTube, which Dr. Vishal, many of his speeches are there. So some of your questions will be answered in the YouTube. The Facebook is also there. You could connect with Dr. Vishal's Facebook, and the YouTube, you can subscribe because many more new recordings are happening about the upcoming book. So you can take that one also. Okay, I can see some hands raised. Namrata, do you have some questions? You can ask it, or yes, Zoe, you can unmute yourself and ask.
No, I'll just ask. There's one written question which has come.
Sure.
I'll just ask that, and then what can be done in today's scenario to restore integrity and forsake corruption in our country?
Thank you. A week or so ago in Chennai, we had a lecture which Brother John Samuel and I were speaking on good governance, and we will soon have a video on my YouTube channel on the question of answering the question that you have raised. But briefly, one of the things that historians don't tell you about India is everybody knows that IAS, originally Indian Civil Services, then Indian Administrative Services, Indian Police Services, they were products, that was the steel frame of India. British policy, both during the East India Company rule and the Crown's rule, the British policy, political policy was a mess. But in spite of the failure of English policy for India, British rule continued and succeeded because the administrator, civil servants, police force, they were men and women of integrity. Who created this Indian civil services, in which I'm including the police? These were sons, second and third sons of poor pastors in England. Most of the deputy collectors, engineers, military officers were sons of pastors. Claudius Buchanan, who was the provost of Fort William College, where civil servants were trained, which continues as Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy in Missouri now. Claudius Buchanan, because his wife was sick, he often had to go to England. He traveled around England, challenging British Christians, the evangelicals, that look, don't leave India to traders and soldiers. You must send in good Christians from good Christian homes to India to govern India. So pastors' first son will stay at home, and these were poor pastors, independent churches, Baptist churches, etc. The second son, a third son, will go first to Haileybury College outside of London, then come to Fort William College, where missionaries are training, and the Bible is the textbook for learning any language in India. And you should read Dr. Babu Varghese' book, Let There Be India, to understand how the Bible translation created all of modern Indian languages, including Hindi and Urdu and Bengali and Gujarati. These were products of Bible translation. If you're going to Gujarat to govern Gujarat as a deputy collector or collector, you have to know Gujarati. There are no textbooks in Gujarati except the Bible. So all of these people were reading the Bible who were going to administer India. And Peter Drucker, the management guru, in his 1973 book, has a very long description of how it was the sons of the pastors. They had a profound impact on the nation, which, to illustrate one point, we were experts in bribing, we as Indians. Earlier, for the first 50 years of its rule, the administrators of East India Company had been taking huge bribes because Lord Clive himself had taken 20,000 rupees when he won the Battle of Plassey as a bribe to install the new Nawab. But everybody was taking bribe, and the evangelical movement said, no, if we love our neighbor as ourselves, we must give to India as good a government as we want for ourselves. That's why the Fort William College was created, and missionaries such as William Carey were training civil servants, and these civil servants were being prayed for by their churches, by their families. They were praying. So when a young boy of 24 years old goes to a remote tehsil as a deputy collector, people are bribing him. And one of the bribe is women. People are bringing women to him. And he's yield to the temptation. But many of these people, they know that their parents are praying that they will remain pure and they will serve God. They refuse these kinds of bribes. They retire with very modest pensions. They were the people who built the modern police force and civil services in India, and the courts and the dams. Sir Arthur Cotton was an evangelist who built the dam over Godavari River. His daughter, Elizabeth Hope, was an evangelist who lived next door to Charles Darwin, etc. So the Roorkee IIT begins by the administrative and engineering leaders who were sons of pastors. One of them was trained personally by the father of evangelicalism, Charles Simeon. I won't go more into the details, but the answer to your question is that it was British evangelical movement which gave to India police officers, civil servants, military engineers who transformed this nation. We have lost all of that history because our prophecy experts are concerned about tribulation and Antichrist coming, etc. We aren't hearing about what God is doing to bless this nation and make India a great nation. So I stop there, but hopefully you've just got a hint. Do check out the website, thirdeducationrevolution.com. Buy the book, Third Education Revolution. Bless India is part of Third Education Revolution in India, which is bringing about not just educational revolution, training of civil servants in every city, in every church. So with the help of Madras Christian College, we hope to create the best curriculum for training civil servants and police officers, make that curriculum available to every church, its smallest hut in a village in India, so that once again, the church trains godly men and women to become the steel frame of a nation that God can bless. So yes, do please join that, and you can meet with us and talk to us more.